At least I think it's good morning. I was just talking to a good brother here saying, he talked about waking up. I am a night owl. And not as much as I used to be, but I still am. But I had a saying when I went to work that I wouldn't wake up till after work because I didn't want to waste my waking hours. So, morning. We do need to change a new tradition here. The preacher comes up and stands up for 25 and 30 minutes, and the song leaders do not like preachers because they always stand before the lesson, which means the preacher has to stand another 3 or 4 minutes. So, boy, am I good, right? Okay, we need the slide to the lesson. Oh, there we go. Okay, I got you. We have been studying the book of Hebrews. Well, let me start over again. Just an update, as you know, missionary to the Philippines. The numbers haven't changed yet. The team that we sent to Mindanao has just returned. We saw 11 obey the gospel there. However, we have got more invitations than we can handle right now. Some of the quote old time preachers we're so impressed with our work as they're gathered. We've got one area where they've got 12 preachers in training. They said we're going to train them in the way that in the training and the teaching that we presented them. And so God's work is going on. We have, since we started in 2012, we have now passed the 3,000 souls added to God's kingdom. And so that's quite an achievement, really, that God would use who to do his work. But I'm proud of the work. It's not the numbers. Numbers are just a tool that tells us how we're doing, how we're progressing, is what we're doing, is it working, is it effective? And those are just souls that we know about. I know we're probably 20 to 30% higher than that. God knows the number. Amen. So far this year, 249 new Christians and counting. We're not even halfway through the year, so we're excited about that. We've been studying the book of Hebrews, and we're in chapter 3. We have seen in Hebrews chapter 1, well, God exalts Jesus higher than angels, tells them that he calls his own son God in verse 8. And then we transition to Hebrews chapter 2, where for a short period of time, he makes Jesus a little lower than angels. So we're now back in we're going to start Hebrews chapter 3, focus on verses 1 through 6, where the Hebrew writer is now going to bring in another exalted person in history called Moses. And he's going to compare the house of Moses to the house of Jesus and make that comparison of how Jesus is the better covenant. At this time, the Hebrew Christians were being persecuted, not only from the outside, but from the inside, from wanting to go back to what they had. And so that's the main reason why the Hebrew writer is writing this letter, saying, hey, don't give up your pot of gold for a pot of coal that is no longer valid. Today, family, we enjoy many luxuries, and admit luxuries that we take for granted. We enjoy ownership, whether it's a house, car, stocks, bonds, good health, savings accounts, health insurance. Boy, is that important. I had a surgery this year without insurance, $130,000. You know what I paid? $25,000. I could afford that. Whether it's pensions and retirement account, 401k, Social Security. Family, when we look at the world, that is a luxury. And yet we all recognize that the day will come that our life here on earth is going to come to an end. And no matter how good we have it, our life is imperfect. Taxes, health, family problems, it's all temporary. I don't care whether you look at Donald Trump, George Soros, Bill Gates, whatever. I guarantee you when they have a toothache, they ain't happy and they don't like it, and nobody likes a dentist. It's one reason I didn't want to be a dentist, because everyone hates a dentist. I do. I mean, I'd almost, now the key word is almost. I'd almost rather have a kidney stone than go to the dentist, even if it's just simply for cleaning my teeth. And I've had 8 kidney stones, and that's 9 too many. They're not fun. But eventually, this life, no matter how good we have it, is going to end. So we have a choice of just living this life of comfort, especially if you're fairly wealthy, understanding, but it's a temporary choice, or choosing a life that may make you uncomfortable, that may force you to change, but one that will become permanent for you eventually. How many of us, and I know I have growing up, because I'm 27, well, I am. I'm dyslexic. Next year, I'll be a year older. I'll be 72. Ugh. But how many of you had said, boy, those were the good old days? Ever heard that? Oh, man, I wish we could go back to the good old days. But isn't it funny? I mean, the pasture's always greener on the other side. But were they really so good? Take the typewriter. Some of you young people don't even know what a typewriter is. But I remember taking typing class, and those keys, you hit it and you hit the key, and those, I don't know what you call them, prongs would get stuck. Have to undo it, and then pretty soon they got with the ball. Well, that worked good until the bearing underneath wouldn't work. Now we've got the word processor. We think that's great, except, boy, if once the program goes bad, help, right? Well, then we got the cars. Oh, boy, why can't the cars be like we're used to? But now they're so complicated you can't fix them. But family, I know growing up, when I was a 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, my dad used to love to go up to Yosemite. How many times did you see cars parked on the side of the road, overheated, going to driveway, cars, that was not unusual. You just hoped it didn't happen to you. You don't see that so much today. You do it occasionally. How about this one? Opening the garage door. I remember it didn't have garage door openers. Man, you had to park the car in the garage, sit on the brake, open the door, put it in neutral, get out, open the door, get back in the car, reverse the process, drive in the car, get out, reverse the process, close the door, and in. Boy, that was tough, right? Now we've got garage door openers. How about TVs, black and white TVs? I remember those days. Didn't have remote control. The kids were the remote control. You had 3 channels. Channel 3, 10, and 13 where I was in Turlock. And it went off at 2 o'clock in the morning. And they didn't have cable. They didn't have streaming. Guess what? Black and white. And then you had an antenna on top of your house. And my dad thought he was really proud because he brought this little machine, hooked it up, and you hit it, and it would automatically turn on the antenna. It lasted a couple of months, and pretty soon, us kids became the machine. We'd crawl up on top of the roof, and we'd listen to our dad, and he goes, no, back, left, right, stop, there. I don't like. So, fam, we look at, we want the good old days back. But do we really? And family, that was a decision that these Hebrew Christians had to make. They were dissatisfied where they were. They were being persecuted. They were being harassed. And they were wanting to go back. And they forgot what they had. In Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and the high priest of our confession, Christ Jesus, who was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was faithful in all his house. So now the Hebrew writer is bringing in the 2 houses, the house of Moses in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, if you will, comparing him to Jesus, this new covenant which you are now in possession of. And it's no accident they brought Jesus first because that's their present context. That's who their heart is given to. Followed by Moses. The Hebrew writer knows of this struggle that his people are facing. The key theme here is that Jesus is superior to Moses because he's not a servant in God's house. He is the son over it. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. There is a difference in responsibility. There is a difference in the prestige or in the honor or the benefits of being a son versus being a servant. Too often people confuse status with roles. Those are two different things. They're not the same. Let me ask you a question. Which is more important, the keys or a lock? Well, if you say the keys are more important, you don't have a lock, what good are the keys, right? But if you say, well, the lock is more important because I got to lock my house, lock the safe or whatever, you don't have the key. The difference isn't which one is more important here, it's what is the role. And we each and every one of us have a role. Let me ask you this, now you guys, I'm not a car buff or whatever. As long as it takes me from point A to point B and back to point C, I'm happy. But I love the 64 to 67 Mustang. Gorgeous cars. Which is more important, the car or the tractor? Again, it depends upon what I want. If I want to drive Yosemite, I don't want the tractor. It'd take me 3 weeks to get there. Will it get me there? Yeah. But if I want to plow a field, I don't think I want my Ford Mustang there. I want the tractor. Now, can I do it in the Mustang? Maybe. In the valley? Probably. Up in Sonora? No. They got rocks that God put there to get blisters on your hands and make an easy job hard. We tried to drill post holes when my father bought one of those machines. We had 4 handles and it turned itself. After a couple of tries, my dad said, nope, we're going to break a leg. No, he wasn't going to break a leg. My brother and I were going to break the leg. And my God, my dad had that right. But pretty soon he said, it's too dangerous. Why? Because too many boulders. So a car is not going to plow the field up in the mountains. Status versus roles are two different things. We're talking about now the two heads of state, if we will, Moses and Jesus. Jesus and Moses were both faithful. But there is a difference in a role and status. Notice here that the readers are called holy brothers and sisters. They are part of God's family, part of God's house. So we're going to look at Moses. Moses is the undisputed leader of the Israelites. And it's just obvious by the stories that are told. We remember Moses at the burning bush. I mean, if we look at what Moses lived from, getting a little baby getting thrown in a little reed with crocodiles looking for a little snack, and he gets there, gets raised up in a Pharaoh with riches and wealth and education. He had anything he wanted. If he wanted, he snapped his fingers, he'd go to McDonald's, get it, and bring it back here, and it better be hot. And he ends up for 40 years as a sheep herder. And we know that sheep herders were detested by the Egyptians. So one night, we know the story about the burning bush. Moses didn't want to do it. But yet he did. We know that Moses asked God, said, I want to see who you are. And God says, nope, you can't see my face, but I'll put you in that cleft of the rock and I'll put my hand over you so that because you can't see my face and live, but when I walk back, I'll remove it and you can see my back. We know the story of Moses, how he through God led his people through safety when the Egyptian armies were closing in on him. The Israelites' family were not trained warriors. You're not going to defeat probably at the time the most powerful nation in the world. You're not going to beat them with shovels and rakes and hoes. But yet God says, stand aside. You don't do anything. This God will fight for you. It was Moses who led that. We see the rebellion at Korah, where these leaders were saying, who are you? And God saves Moses and made a dynamic example of those who were in rebellion. And Moses wasn't perfect. He blew it. He was not allowed to enter the promised land, but God allowed him on top of Mount Nebo to look around, see the land of Canaan before he passed away unto God. In Exodus chapter 34, verse 30, afterward all the children of Israel came near, and he gave them his commandments, all that the Lord had spoken with him on Mount Sinai. That's referencing the 10 Commandments. Moses' face was so bright it would shine. He had to put a veil on him. That's Moses leading. In Numbers chapter 12, verses 6 through 8, we have the story of Miriam and Aaron who were rebelling in a way against Moses, claiming that Moses, you become arrogant. You're not have to be the only leader. God would talk with us too. And look at the respect that God had for Moses. He says, not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in my house. Then he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. Then what he's saying there is Moses isn't just faithful most of the time, and he says he's faithful in all my house. He does his best to observe all that I tell him. He says in verse 8, I speak with him face to face, even plainly and not in dark sayings. And he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Man, there's a lesson right there in that verse. I know of an eldership that got brought down with something that involved a vacuum cleaner. Yeah, obviously there were issues behind that, but it was that issue of an elder son taking a vacuum cleaner because his was broken and he didn't ask permission, and an eldership was brought down. If I read New Testament right, that's not what you do. He places elders in a highly esteemed position. But anyway, that's another lesson. But Moses was in that position. He says, God says, how dare you? How do you talk to my servant Moses that way? And we know the rest of that story. For example, in the Old Testament was law. God had to teach his people not only respect for the leadership for himself, but for Moses. There was no grace. For example, contained in the oral law, which the Jewish people refer to as the Mishnah, are at least 1,500 laws only regarding the keeping of the Sabbath. 1,500 just for the Sabbath. Now, these laws were not commanded by God. They were instituted by the Pharisees to protect, with the intent to protect the Mosaic law. But instead, they thrust a burden on the Jewish people, causing enormous guilt and frustration, demanding what they did not have the ability to give. Family, I feel that almost every day. How about you? How many of you can live just one day in perfection and serving God? Just one day. How many? Well, that's what these Israelites were facing. Can you imagine waking up every morning knowing you would fail the Lord your God before you even got out of bed? That's a heavy weight to bear. And that's what these Israelites were facing. As faithful as Moses was, he was still called a servant. And a servant is not a son. Moses was part of the house of God, which is the people of God. But Jesus is the builder of that house. This elevates Jesus above Moses. Now, it doesn't diminish Moses in the least, but it shows Christ's divine authority and his creative power. When you look at a building, whether it's the Salesforce building, whether back then when I was a kid, the Marble was the Transamerica building, that was something. When you look at the Golden Gate Bridge, they're beautiful buildings, beautiful structures, but who gets the glory? People who built it. It's the same thing with God's church. The glory goes to the builder, not what was built. When we compare the two covenants of what God built and what he intended, Jesus in Matthew 11:29-30 says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." But boy, sometimes, family, it doesn't feel that way, right? I mean, we had the story of this guy that worked at city. He says, "You go clean up the sewer system in his pond. The grates have been plugged up, and we need to clean it." And this guy went out there for 2 or 3 days. The foreman came out there and said, "What's wrong?" He says, "Dude, it's hard to keep your mind on the job when the swamp's full of alligators." Sometimes that's what life feels like. But we forget that who our leader is Jesus. We forget to give our burdens and our cares to him. And that's what was happening with these early morning Christians. They were urged to focus on Jesus, who is both an apostle, which simply means a messenger that's sent by God, and a high priest, because Jesus is one who represents us to God. Hebrews chapter 2 tells us again that Jesus was made a little bit lower than angels. Why? Because he had to suffer death in order to defeat Satan, who was the master of death. He had to die so he could defeat death. In 1 Peter 3:18, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, that just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, therefore being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit." He died one time for us. You see, the law of Moses offered no hope, no forgiveness. It was not perfect. But God never intended the Old Testament to be the vehicle where we achieve salvation. In Hebrews chapter 8, verse 7-13, "For if that the first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second." In that he says, "A new covenant he has made, that the first is obsolete. Now that which is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away." Romans 15:4 tells us that Old Testament was recorded. It was written down so it would bring us to the knowledge of God. So we could understand who God is. Galatians chapter 3, verse 24-25 says that it called it a tutor to bring us to the knowledge of Christ. The Titus 3:5 is an interesting verse because it says, "But according to his mercy, he saved us through the working of regeneration and renewing of the Holy Spirit." Now that word washing is that key word in that verse. Washing. Well, the Greek word for washing is lutro. Now, in the Greek, there's a apostrophe over that U, and I don't know how to do that with the word processor, so my grammar is wrong in typing there, so I get a B+. But in Hebrew, the Hebrew word for lutro is laver. Now, what's a laver? A washing basin And I don't know about you, but on the Day of Atonement, when they would be sacrificing animals like crazy, I just envisioned this laver as something a little bit bigger than a bird bath. No. That's an artist's rendition of what the laver looked like, and it was huge. It was not a bird bath, family. On that Day of Atonement, by the end of the day, they would take a goat and they would tie a ribbon around it and send them off into the wilderness. That's where we get the term scapegoat. There were thousands and thousands, if not millions, of animals sacrificed that day. There was blood, literally streams of blood flowing down there. You couldn't walk there with the had shoes on. You may be ankle deep in blood. That's how much blood was being shed on the sacrifice of these animals. And before that priest could go into the Holy of Holies on this one day, he had to cleanse himself from that blood, that robe, because you cut an animal's throat, especially if it's a bull, you cannot walk in God's presence with a sin. So he had to wash himself before he went in, and it was in that laver. That laver was 15 feet in diameter. It was 7.5 feet tall. And it was 45 feet around in circumference. In fact, it was called the sea, is how large this laver was. 2 Chronicles 4:2. The sea. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 3 and 4. For this one has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as he who built the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. So now the Hebrew writer is transitioning, saying, okay, we've talked about Moses. Now we're going to look at who is this builder? Who is this Jesus that is worthy, has more worth, more value? First, Hebrews 1 talks about a little bit. I like Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 and 18, where it says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may have preeminence, not second class. Preeminence. He is number one. Acts 20:28 says that he purchased the church with his own blood. He owns the church. He is head of the church. And guess what, family? It cost him everything. No wonder he has a right to wear that mantle of preeminence. Matthew chapter 28, verse 18, Jesus, before he ascends to heaven, says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Servants don't have that. Servants work under the authority of the owner. Servants don't have an inheritance. An inheritance comes from a relationship called being a son or a daughter. In John chapter 5, verse 21, 23, look what God says. He says, for the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will. For the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all should honor the Son just as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Boy, that contradicts some of these quote-unquote churches today, doesn't it? Hebrews 1:8, but to the Son he says, your throne, your power, your authority is forever. And he calls, oh God. Jesus is not a created being. He's not just a human or a wise teacher. He is God. Matthew chapter 12, verses 3 through 8. But he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him. Now we're talking again about the issues of being a son, being preeminent. He is the builder. And this is what Jesus is talking about when he and his disciples are falling through the wheat field on the Sabbath, picking grains of wheat. And again, remember those 1,500 laws, that man-made laws just on the Sabbath? This is why this is what this story about. He says, and he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who are with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, that I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. He is Lord over the Sabbath. He made the rules. He made the commandments. But he says, I'm Lord because I'm the Son. In John chapter 10, verse 11 to 18, we're not going to read this, but again, it's the difference between being a son and being a servant. Here, the story, it's not a perfect correlation, but Jesus says here, he says, I'm the good shepherd, and the shepherd gives his life for the sheep. He will protect his sheep. He feeds his sheep. He nourishes his sheep. He leads his sheep. But the hireling, a servant who is not invested in this, when danger comes, when it becomes inconvenient for him, when he sees something better, he runs and he doesn't care about the sheep. But Jesus does. Because he's not a servant. He is better than a servant. He is a son. Hebrews 3:5, and Moses indeed was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which would be spoken afterward. Deuteronomy 34:10 to 12. But since there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all signs and wonders which the Lord sent to him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Moses was a great leader. He was faithful to God. The writer in verse 6, but Christ as son over his own house, whose house we are if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm to the end. He says, family, this is what you've got. But that key word is if. 2 letters, and it's the biggest word in the world. If. I-F. How many of you in the days past, when they had Publishers Clearinghouse, you got this package, right? Or the letter says, you have won $5 million if your numbers match. Now, could I take that check to the bank and I'll endorse it and hand it to the cashier? Are they going to give me that $5 million? Why not? Because that little word called if. And the Hebrew writer is saying, if you hold firm. He's trying to encourage them. If, hold firm. Hold fast that confidence that you saw when you committed your soul to Jesus. Don't lose that. Because if you do, you lose everything. In John chapter 5, verse 44 to 47, how can you believe who receive honor from one another and do not seek the honor that comes from the only God? Do not think that I shall accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust. Again, this is Jesus speaking, and look at the honor he's giving Moses. He's using Moses as an example. That's an amazing thing. Here's the Son of God, God himself. And he specifically points to Moses. For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? John 14:6, Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. You see, Jesus is a son. In John 14:1-3, in closing, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions, and if it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. Well, family, he had to die. He goes to prepare a place for us, and I believe, family, he's talking about the cross. No one else could go to that cross except him. Period. He was the only one that was sinless. It was through that cross that he prepared that place for us. That was the only way. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. You see, family, the early Hebrew Christians faced persecution, and they had a decision to make. Stay faithful and persevere through hardship. Don't lose what you got. And in doing so, keep their promised reward. But family, the same promise, the same statement that this Hebrew writer is making to these early century Christians is the same question that applies to us. Stay faithful and persevere through hardship and keep your promised reward. Or they could give up their freedom in Christ and become slaves to their old life. It's the same choice that we all have to make. That's the lesson. I hope you've benefited by being here, and I thank you for coming. If you have any needs that we can help you with, have you obeyed the gospel? Have you obeyed the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus? Would you like prayers on your behalf? If you have any needs, please let us know while we stand and sing.